The zenith spire pierced the upper atmosphere like a blade of polished obsidian, its vast superstructure glittering under the pale light of a distant star. From orbit, it looked serene, elegant, untouchable. But inside, beneath layers of diplomatic halls and ceremonial chambers, tension moved like a living thing. Human boots echoed against the pristine alloy flooring, too loud, too heavy for a place built on etiquette instead of war. Sergeant Darian Hutchinson adjusted the strap of his rifle as he walked, his eyes scanning every reflective surface out of habit. The coalition guards posted along the corridor stood taller, their armor sleeker, their movements more precise. They didn't trust humans. Not fully. Darian didn't blame them. "Relax, Hutch," came a voice over his comm, "you're making the diplomats nervous." Darian didn't slow his pace. Diplomats should be nervous. A quiet chuckle followed. Specialist Jenkins. Always too calm for someone standing in the middle of an alien power center. "It's a peace summit, not a battlefield." "Same thing," Darian muttered. Ahead, the massive doors to the royal chamber stood open, revealing a glimpse of something almost surreal. Towering alien architecture curved upward like living crystal, glowing softly with bioluminescent veins. At the center stood Queen Beatrice herself, her presence commanding even from a distance. Beside her, smaller, almost hidden by the folds of her gown, was the young princess. Darian's gaze lingered for half a second longer than protocol allowed. "Eyes front, Sergeant," another voice cut in. "Captain Briggs this time, sharp and controlled. You're here to guard, not stare." "Yes, sir." Still, something about the scene didn't sit right. It wasn't the grandeur. It wasn't the alien designs or the unfamiliar faces. It was the silence between movements. The way coalition guards shifted their weight just a fraction too slowly. The way certain officials avoided eye contact. Darian had spent enough time in war zones to recognize it. This wasn't peace. This was the moment before something broke. A group of human personnel moved into position along the perimeter, their heavier armor contrasting against the sleek elegance of coalition security. Lieutenant O'Connor leaned casually against a pillar nearby, though his hand never strayed far from his sidearm. "You feel it too?" O'Connor asked quietly as Darian took his post. Darian nodded once. "Yeah. Command says everything's clean." "Command isn't here." O'Connor smirked faintly. "Fair." Across the chamber, Ambassador Richard Sterling stood in animated conversation with several coalition officials. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect. Too perfect. He gestured smoothly, confidently, like a man who knew exactly how this would all end. Darian watched him for a moment longer than necessary. "Problem?" Jenkins asked. Darian hesitated. "Oh, just watching." "Relax, Sergeant," she said. "Not everything's a conspiracy." Darian didn't respond, because sometimes it was. A low hum vibrated through the structure, almost imperceptible. Most wouldn't notice it, but Darian felt it through his boots, through the reinforced plating beneath his feet. He stiffened. "You catch that?" he asked. "Catch what?" Jenkins replied. Before he could answer, the chamber lights flickered, just once. Then stabilized. Around them, conversations resumed. Laughter returned. Diplomats smiled like nothing had happened. But Darian's grip tightened on his rifle. "Captain," he said quietly into the comm, "we've got a power fluctuation." "Noted," Briggs replied. "Engineering's already flagged it. Stay sharp." "Stay sharp." Darian almost laughed. He never wasn't. His eyes drifted again, this time toward the princess. She was watching the crowd with quiet curiosity, her small hand clutching the edge of her mother's gown. Innocent, unaware. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She smiled. It was small, hesitant, but real. Darian felt something twist in his chest. And then, a second vibration hit. Stronger. This time, everyone felt it. The massive windows lining the chamber flickered, their energy fields shimmering as if disturbed by something far beyond the spire. A murmur spread across the room. "What was that?" someone whispered. Darian didn't wait for an answer. "Briggs," he snapped, "that wasn't a fluctuation." "I know," the captain replied, voice suddenly hard. All units stand by. The world exploded. A deafening blast tore through the lower levels of the spire, the shockwave ripping upward with terrifying force. The floor beneath them shuddered violently as screams erupted across the chamber. Lights died instantly, plunging everything into chaos lit only by emergency strobes. Darien was already moving. Contact! Contact! He shouted, dragging a stunned coalition official behind a pillar as debris rained down from above. Through the shattered remains of a far wall, figures poured in. Not diplomats. Not guards. Soldiers. Their armor burned crimson under the flashing lights, their weapons already firing. The Crimson Lance. Ambush! O'Connor roared, returning fire as plasma bolts scorched the air around them. Darien's heart slammed against his ribs. This wasn't a breach. This was an execution. And someone had opened the door. The first volley didn't just hit, it erased. A line of coalition guards at the far end of the chamber vanished in a flash of white-hot plasma, their shields collapsing like glass under a hammer. The blast wave slammed into the pillars, cracking the elegant structures and sending shards of glowing material raining down across the floor. Darien didn't think. He moved. Form up. Defensive positions. Captain Briggs' voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding, but already strained under the sheer scale of the attack. Too many hostiles. Way too many. Crimson-armored soldiers flooded into the chamber with terrifying precision, their movements coordinated, disciplined. This wasn't a random assault. It was planned down to the second. They're inside the perimeter. Jenkins shouted, dropping to one knee as she unleashed controlled bursts downrange. Her round struck an incoming attacker, shattering his energy shield just long enough for a second shot to punch through his chest. He dropped. 3 more took his place. Darien slid into cover behind a fractured support column, his rifle already up. He tracked a target, center mass, fired. The recoil thudded against his shoulder as the kinetic round slammed through a hostile's shield and sent him crashing backward. Left side. They're flanking. O'Connor yelled. I see them. Darien pivoted, firing again, forcing a group of advancing enemies to duck behind debris. Plasma bolts scorched past his position, close enough to burn the air. The smell of ionized metal filled his lungs. This wasn't containment. This was a slaughter. Where the hell is Coalition Command? Jenkins snapped. No response, someone answered. Of course there wasn't. Because this wasn't chaos. This was coordinated. Darien risked a glance toward the center of the chamber, and his blood ran cold. The royal platform was exposed. Coalition guards lay scattered, their formation broken in seconds. The defensive line that should have held for minutes, at least minutes, had collapsed almost instantly. Too fast. Way too fast. Captain, Darien said, voice tight, they knew exactly where to hit. Briggs didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. They all understood. This wasn't just an attack. This was betrayal. A thunderous impact shook the chamber again as a secondary explosion ripped through the upper levels, sending a cascade of debris crashing down. A section of the ceiling collapsed entirely, cutting off half the exits in a storm of fire and twisted metal. We're boxed in. O'Connor shouted. No, Briggs snapped. We're not boxed in, we're being herded. The words hit like a punch. Herded. Darien's gaze snapped back to the royal platform. The Queen was still standing. Barely. 2 remaining guards had formed a desperate shield in front of her, their energy barriers flickering under sustained fire. Behind her, the small figure of the princess clung tightly, eyes wide with terror. Another volley slammed into the shields. 1 guard dropped. Then the other. The barrier collapsed. No, Darien pushed off cover before he even realized he'd moved. Sergeant, hold position. Briggs barked. But Darien wasn't listening anymore. Because in that moment, everything else disappeared. The noise. The orders. The battlefield. All of it faded behind one simple, undeniable truth. There was a child standing in the open. And no one between her and the guns. A Crimson Lance trooper raised his weapon, locking onto the platform. Darien's pulse spiked. Too far. Too exposed. No time. He ran anyway. Plasma fire tore across the chamber, forcing him to zigzag through falling debris and shattered pillars. A blast struck just behind him, the shockwave nearly throwing him off his feet. He kept going. Darian, fall back. That's an order. Briggs shouted. Orders didn't matter anymore. Another explosion rocked the floor, sending a wave of heat across his armor. Warning indicators flashed across his visor, screaming about structural instability, incoming fire, probability of death. He ignored all of it. Because the trooper was taking aim. Because the princess wasn't moving. Because no one else was close enough. Darian raised his rifle mid-sprint and fired. The shot cracked through the chaos, slamming into the attacker's shoulder and throwing his aim wide. The plasma bolt discharged harmlessly into the ceiling instead of the platform. But it wasn't enough. More enemies were closing in. Too many. Darian reached the base of the platform just as another wave of Crimson Lance soldiers advanced, their weapons already glowing with charged energy. He didn't slow down. Didn't hesitate. Didn't think. He vaulted up the steps, planting himself between the incoming fire and the two figures behind him. For a split second, everything froze. The queen looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Not as a soldier. Not as a human. But as the only thing standing between her child and death. Darian didn't look back. He just tightened his grip on his rifle. And stood his ground. Not today. Sergeant, fall back. That's a direct order. Captain Briggs' voice tore through the comms, sharp, absolute. Darian didn't move. The words registered. Training kicked in automatically, years of discipline screaming at him to obey, to reposition, to survive. But his boots stayed planted. Because behind him, he could hear it. The quiet, uneven breathing of a terrified child. Another volley slammed into the platform, forcing Darian to shift his stance as plasma scorched across his armor. Warning alerts flared across his visor, shield integrity dropping, heat levels spiking. He ignored them. Darian. Jenkins snapped. You're exposed. Get back here. No, he said, voice low but steady. It wasn't defiance. It was certainty. A Crimson Lance trooper charged up the steps, blade igniting in a crackle of energy. Darian pivoted and fired point blank, the kinetic round punching straight through the attacker's chest and sending him collapsing at his feet. More were coming. Always more. Darian took a half step forward, placing himself fully between the advancing enemies and the queen. Your Majesty, he said without turning, you need to move. Now. For a brief second, there was silence behind him. Then the queen's voice, controlled but carrying something deeper beneath it. My guard is gone. I noticed. Another burst of fire forced him to duck slightly as fragments of the platform shattered around them. The situation was deteriorating by the second. You have a secondary exit? Darian asked. The pause. Yes, she said. Service corridors beneath the West Wing. But we won't reach them. Not through this. Darian glanced quickly at his tactical display. She was right. The main chamber was already overrun. Every route out was either blocked or under heavy fire. Coalition defenses had collapsed too quickly, too cleanly. Someone had made sure of that. Captain, Darian said into comms, I've got the Queen and the Princess. We need an extraction route. There was a burst of static, followed by Briggs' voice, tighter now. Negative. All routes are compromised. We're pulling back to defensive positions. Darian's jaw clenched. Sir, they won't survive that. Sergeant, that's not your call. Darian closed his eyes for half a second. That's not your call. Maybe it wasn't. But if he stepped away, if he followed orders, retreated, regrouped, they would die. He opened his eyes again. Decision made. Then I'm making it mine. Darian, Briggs started. Darian cut the channel. For a moment, the chaos around him felt distant, muted. Like the world had narrowed down to a single point. One choice. Behind him, the princess shifted slightly. He could feel it more than hear it. Fragile. Trusting him without even understanding why. He exhaled slowly. Then turned his head just enough to glance back. She was staring at him, wide-eyed, her small hands clutching her mother's armor. Afraid, but not crying. "Hey," Darian said, his voice softer now, completely at odds with the war raging around them. "You see that corridor over there?" He nodded toward a partially collapsed archway to the left, smoke billowing from within. "We're gonna go that way. Stay close to your mom, all right?" She didn't answer. Just nodded. That was enough. Darian turned back to the fight just as another wave of Crimson Lance troops pushed forward. Their formation tightened, weapons raised in unison. They knew what he was doing. They knew what was behind him. And they were going to end it. "All right," Darian muttered to himself, adjusting his grip on the rifle. "Let's make this hurt." He stepped forward. Not back. Forward. The first attacker reached him in seconds. Darian fired twice, center mass, dropping him instantly. He pivoted, using the falling body as partial cover as another volley streaked past. "Move," he barked over his shoulder. He didn't wait to see if they listened. He just started pushing. Every step was contested. Every inch fought for. Plasma fire tore across the platform, forcing him to weave through the chaos as he advanced. His rifle bucked repeatedly, each shot calculated, precise. Shields flared and shattered under the sheer kinetic force of his rounds. But they kept coming. They always kept coming. A blast caught him from the side, throwing him hard against the edge of the platform. Pain flared through his ribs as warning systems screamed in his ear. Armor integrity compromised. Internal damage probable. He gritted his teeth and forced himself back up. Not now. Behind him, he could hear movement. The queen, the princess, following. But that meant he couldn't stop. Darian reached the base of the platform and immediately dropped into a crouch behind a chunk of fallen structure, returning fire as enemy forces closed in from multiple angles. "Left side," he shouted instinctively. A beam of plasma slammed into the cover, melting part of it instantly. Too exposed. Too many angles. This wasn't going to hold. He scanned quickly, then saw it. The corridor. Half collapsed. Burning. Narrow. Perfect. "Go," he yelled, pointing toward it. "Now." The queen didn't hesitate this time. Darian shifted position, laying down suppressive fire as she moved past him, the princess clinging tightly to her side. For a brief moment, he caught a glimpse of the child's face again. Still afraid. But moving. Still trusting. But that was all that mattered. A Crimson Lance soldier broke through the smoke, charging straight toward them. Darian stepped into him, slamming the butt of his rifle into the attacker's helmet before firing a single round that dropped him instantly. More footsteps. More incoming fire. Darian backed toward the corridor entrance, covering the retreat, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. "Almost there," he muttered under his breath. Another blast rocked the chamber, closer this time, sending a shockwave that nearly knocked him off his feet again. The structure around them groaned, metal twisting under stress. The whole spire was coming apart, and they were right in the middle of it. The queen reached the corridor entrance and turned back for a split second. Their eyes met again. This time, there was no distance in it. No diplomacy. No hierarchy. Just understanding. Darian gave a single nod. She disappeared into the smoke. Darian turned back to the battlefield one last time, raising his rifle as another wave of enemies advanced through the fire and debris. Alone now. Outnumbered. Exactly where he needed to be. "All right," he said quietly, steadying his aim. "Come get me." The corridor swallowed them whole. Smoke choked the air, thick and acrid, turning every breath into a fight. Emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting broken shadows that twisted with every distant explosion. The elegant architecture of the spire was gone here, replaced by raw utility, narrow passageways, exposed conduits, and scorched metal. Darian moved in last, sealing the rear. "Keep moving," he said, voice low but urgent. "Don't stop for anything." The queen didn't argue. She carried the princess tighter against her side, her regal composure now sharpened into something colder, focused survival. Behind her, the child clung silently, her small fingers gripping the fabric of her mother's armor. But silence meant control. Silence meant she hadn't broken. A thunderous crash echoed behind them as part of the corridor they just passed collapsed inward, sealing off the path. Dust and debris blasted forward, forcing Darian to raise an arm to shield his visor. "They're cutting us off," he muttered. "They're hurting us," the Queen corrected, her voice steady despite the chaos. Darian didn't respond. Because she was right. A distant echo of boots pounded somewhere behind the collapsing sections. Heavy, synchronized, relentless. They were still coming. Of course they were. Darian pushed forward, scanning every intersection, every shadow. His HUD flickered intermittently, struggling to maintain clarity through the interference and structural damage. "Left," the Queen said suddenly, pointing toward a branching corridor. Darian didn't question it. "Move." They turned sharply, boots skidding slightly on debris-covered flooring. Sparks rained from a ruptured conduit overhead, lighting the passage in violent flashes of blue-white energy. The heat was rising. The entire structure was destabilizing faster than expected. "How far?" Darian asked. 2 levels down," she replied. "There is a transport shaft that leads to the lower hangars." "Is it secure?" A brief pause. "No. Figures." A deafening explosion rocked the level above them, the shockwave tearing through the corridor like a physical force. The walls groaned, metal warping under pressure. A section of ceiling collapsed ahead, blocking half the passage. Darian didn't slow. He vaulted the debris first, turning immediately to help. The Queen passed the princess forward without hesitation. "Got you," Darian said as he caught her, setting her down quickly on the other side. For a split second, she looked up at him, her face smudged with soot, eyes wide but still steady. "You're okay," he said, more to keep her moving than anything else. "Stay close." She nodded again. No tears. Still holding it together. Stronger than most soldiers he'd seen. Darian helped the Queen over next, then swung his rifle back into position just as movement flickered at the far end of the corridor. Too fast. Too organized. "Contact," he snapped. The first Crimson Lance trooper rounded the corner at full speed, weapon already raised. Darian fired instantly. The shot cracked through the confined space, the impact slamming the attacker back into the wall. But there were more behind him, stacking, advancing, pushing forward with brutal efficiency. "Go!" Darian barked. The Queen grabbed the princess and ran. Darian stepped forward into the choke point. This was where he made it count. The corridor narrowed here, limiting their numbers. It was the only advantage he had, and he used it. One shot. One kill. Another. Another. Each round was deliberate, controlled, tearing through shields before the enemy could fully stabilize their advance. The confined space amplified the chaos, plasma bolts scorching the walls, debris exploding outward with every impact. A blast clipped his shoulder, spinning him halfway around. Pain flared instantly, sharp and hot, as warning alerts screamed across his visor. Armor breach. He ignored it. Stepped back into position. Kept firing. "They're still coming." Jenkins' voice crackled faintly over the comm, distorted by interference. "Darian, where the hell are you?" "Busy," he grunted, dropping another attacker at close range. "You need to fall back." "Can't." The pause. Then quieter, understanding. "Copy." The line went dead again. Darian exhaled sharply, forcing air into lungs that felt like they were burning. His arms were starting to feel heavier, movements just a fraction slower. Not good. Not yet. He took another step back. Then another. Firing. Always firing. The enemy pressed harder now, realizing what he was doing, trying to break through by sheer volume. A grenade clattered against the floor near his position, its core glowing as it armed. Damn it. Darian kicked it back down the corridor just as it detonated, the explosion ripping through the front ranks of the advancing soldiers. The blast bought him seconds. Precious seconds. He turned and ran. The corridor twisted sharply ahead, leading down toward a sloping ramp. He caught up to the Queen just as she reached the descent, the princess still clutched tightly against her. "Move, move," he urged, glancing back only once. Shadows moved through the smoke behind them. Still coming. Always coming. They descended rapidly, boots pounding against the metal as the temperature dropped slightly with each level. The air here was thicker, heavier, filled with the distant hum of massive machinery. Lower levels. Closer to the hangars. Closer to escape. Or death. Another explosion rocked the structure above, sending a ripple through the ramp beneath their feet. The lights flickered violently, then dimmed to a deep red emergency glow. Structural collapse imminent, a distorted automated voice echoed faintly through the corridor. "Yeah," Darian muttered. "I got that." They reached the bottom of the ramp and emerged into a wider passage, one that opened into something far worse. Darian froze for half a second. Because the path ahead wasn't empty. It was waiting. A full squad of Crimson Lance soldiers stood between them and the transport shaft, weapons raised, perfectly positioned. They hadn't just chased them. They had predicted them. Set the trap. Darian stepped forward anyway, raising his rifle despite the burning pain tearing through his body. Behind him, he could feel the Queen stop. Feel the hesitation. Feel the realization. There was no way through this. Not clean. Not easy. Not without a cost. Darian tightened his grip on the rifle, his breathing slowing despite everything screaming at him to panic. This was it. The line. He shifted slightly, placing himself just a little more in front of them. Not even consciously. Just instinct. "Stay behind me," he said quietly. The enemy squad advanced in unison. Weapons glowing. No hesitation. No mercy. Darian steadied his aim. And stepped forward to meet them. The stars didn't burn quietly anymore. They screamed. Every sensor aboard the forward observation array lit up at once, drowning the command deck in a cascade of crimson warnings. Not from enemy fire. Not from weapons lock. From something far worse. Human movement. Admiral Threx of the Virelian Coalition stood frozen at the center of the tactical chamber, his four eyes locked on the projection that now dominated the room. It wasn't the scale of the human fleet that made his breath hitch. It was the formation. "They're not deploying defensively," one of his analysts whispered, voice trembling. They weren't. The human ships were aligning into a forward spear formation. Tight, aggressive, and utterly reckless. No spacing protocols. No shield buffering distance. No regard for survival percentages. They were charging. "That's impossible," Threx muttered, his claws tightening against the console. "They don't have confirmation of enemy strength. They don't even know what's waiting beyond the nebula." But deep down, he already knew the truth. They didn't care. The projection shifted, zooming in on the lead vessel. A monstrous warship, its hull scarred and blackened, like it had survived 100 wars and was hungry for another. Its engines burned brighter than physics should allow, pushing it far beyond safe operational limits. "Identify that ship," Threx ordered. The pause. Confirmed designation. Us Resolute. The name echoed through the chamber like a death sentence. Because everyone in that room had heard of it. The ship that never retreated. The ship that broke sieges by ramming straight through them. The ship whose captain once held position against an entire pirate armada just to buy time for a single evacuation shuttle. Threx felt something unfamiliar crawl up his spine. "They're accelerating," the analyst said, panic now bleeding into his tone. "They're ignoring all standard engagement protocols. At this speed they'll hit the conflict zone in under 6 minutes. 6 minutes. That wasn't enough time to coordinate a proper defensive grid. Not enough time to reinforce the outer lines. Not enough time to—" "They're broadcasting something," another officer interrupted. Threx snapped his gaze toward the comm station. "Put it through." Static filled the chamber for half a second. Then a human voice cut through. Steady. Unshaken. "This is Captain Elias Varn of the US Resolute to all coalition forces. Hold your positions." Threx felt his mandibles twitch. Hold positions? That wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. "You are outnumbered and outgunned," Varn continued, his tone almost conversational. "If you engage now, you will break. So don't." A ripple of disbelief spread across the bridge. "He's giving us commands?" one officer hissed. But Threx raised a claw. silencing the room. Because there was something in that voice. Not arrogance. Certainty. "We are entering the battlefield at full burn," Varn said. "We will punch a hole through their center line. When we do, you follow." Threx stared at the projection again. At the human fleet. At the sheer insanity of what they were attempting. Punch through? Against that? The enemy formation wasn't just large, it was fortified. Layered shields, interlocking weapon grids, automated defense swarms. It was designed to stop exactly this kind of assault. And yet, "They're not slowing down," the analyst whispered. Of course they weren't. Threx exhaled slowly, his mind racing. Every instinct he had, every doctrine, every war simulation, every century of coalition strategy, told him this would fail. Catastrophically. But then, his eyes drifted back to the name on the screen. Resolute. And suddenly, the simulations didn't seem so certain anymore. "Impact in 30 seconds, the tactical officer announced. The entire chamber went silent. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were locked on the projection as the human fleet closed the final distance. 20 seconds. The enemy formation reacted, of course. Defensive arrays lit up, unleashing a storm of plasma fire and kinetic rounds. Enough firepower to vaporize entire fleets. The humans didn't dodge. They didn't scatter. They didn't even slow down. They drove straight into it. 10 seconds. The first human ship took a direct hit. Its shields shattered instantly, its hull tearing apart in a violent explosion. But the formation didn't break. 5 seconds. Another ship went down. Then another. Still they pushed forward. 3, 2, 1. The screen erupted in light. For a moment, it was impossible to see anything, just a blinding collision of energy and fire as the human fleet slammed directly into the enemy line. The light cleared, and Threx felt his breath leave him. The enemy formation was broken. Not weakened. Not disrupted. Broken. A massive, jagged gap had been torn straight through its center, like a spear driven through flesh. Ships were spinning out of control, their formations shattered, their coordination gone. "How?" someone whispered. Threx didn't answer, because he was already staring at the next development. The human ships that had survived the charge weren't retreating. They were turning. Inside the enemy formation. "They're flanking from within," the analyst said, disbelief thick in his voice. Of course they were. Of course. Because for humans, the most dangerous place in a battle wasn't the front line. It was the place no one was insane enough to go. Threx's claws tightened again, but this time not from fear. From realization. "Signal all coalition forces," he said, his voice low, steady. "Advance." The officers hesitated for only a fraction of a second before relaying the command. Because now they understood. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't recklessness. This was a strategy no one else in the galaxy would ever dare to use. And it was working. As the coalition fleets surged forward to exploit the opening, Threx allowed himself one final glance at the burning heart of the battlefield, where human ships fought like cornered predators, surrounded on all sides and still pushing deeper. Relentless. Unbreakable. Terrifying. For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Threx realized something that would change the way he saw war forever. Humans didn't fight to survive. They fought like survival was optional. Inside the shattered core of the battlefield, space itself seemed to bend under the weight of violence. Hull fragments drifted like burning snow through the void. Disabled ships flickered in and out of emergency power, their distress beacons screaming into a silence no one was listening to anymore. The enemy formation had been broken, but the cost of that break was still being paid in blood and metal. And still, the humans advanced. Enemy command cluster identified. The tactical officer shouted over the chaos. "They're regrouping behind the second containment ring." Admiral Threx narrowed his gaze. The projection zoomed in, revealing it, a heavily armored command nexus, surrounded by rotating shield pylons and escort cruisers forming a tight defensive spiral. A fortress inside a graveyard. "They're trying to stabilize the line," someone said. "If they succeed." "They won't," Threx interrupted. His own voice surprised him, because he had stopped thinking like a coalition admiral and started thinking like them, the humans. On the forward feed, the U.S. Resolute was no longer alone. It had become the anchor point of something far more dangerous, a concentrated spearhead of human vessels carving deeper into enemy space, refusing to be cut off no matter how many flanks closed in. But something was wrong. Even Threx could see it now. The Resolute was damaged. Badly. Its port side was gone in sections, exposed internal structures glowing with emergency seals. One of its main engines sputtered intermittently, pushing the ship forward in violent, unstable bursts. It should have fallen back. It should have been rescued. Instead, it was accelerating. Captain Varn is still on the bridge, the comms officer reported. He's requesting tactical relay access to all coalition strike groups. Threx hesitated. Put him through. Static cleared again. And there he was. Captain Elias Varn stood in the middle of a dimly lit command deck, smoke drifting through the air behind him. His uniform was torn at the shoulder, his face streaked with soot and blood that wasn't all his. But his eyes were calm. Too calm. We're inside their perimeter, Varn said without preamble. We've got maybe 4 minutes before they fully re-establish containment. Threx leaned forward. Captain, your ship is compromised. You need to withdraw and... Withdraw? Varn echoed faintly as if tasting the word. Then he shook his head once. No. The pause. Behind him, alarms continued to blare. Sparks fell from a damaged console. A medic rushed past carrying a stretcher. No one stopped. No one panicked. You don't understand something yet, Admiral, Varn continued. Threx felt something tighten in his chest. And what is that? He asked carefully. Varn stepped closer to the camera. And for the first time, his calm cracked, just slightly. Not into fear. Into something heavier. Resolve sharpened into something almost inhuman. We're not here to survive this engagement, he said. Silence spread across every coalition channel listening in. Threx felt it like a physical pressure. Varn continued. We're here to end it. The channel exploded with overlapping voices, shock, protest, disbelief, but Threx raised his claw again, silencing them all. Because he understood now. Or at least he thought he did. Captain, Threx said slowly, your fleet losses are already exceeding acceptable thresholds. You cannot win a prolonged engagement from inside that formation. Varn nodded once. I know. That answer was worse than any denial. It meant he had already accounted for it. Every loss. Every ship. Every life. And accepted it. Threx's voice dropped. Then what are you doing? A beat of silence. On Varn's screen, something shifted behind him. A massive internal blast door opened, revealing a secondary chamber deep within the Resolute's core. Something large was being powered up. Something Threx's sensors couldn't immediately classify. Varn turned slightly, glancing over his shoulder. Then back to the camera. We're about to do something your doctrine doesn't have a category for, he said quietly. The command deck of the coalition flagship went dead silent. Even the alarms seemed distant now. Varn continued. We're going to remove their center of gravity. Threx frowned. That command cluster is shielded. Even your strongest weapons won't penetrate it in time. For the first time, Varn smiled. Not happily. Not proudly. But like someone standing at the edge of something inevitable. That's why we're not using weapons. The channel cut for half a second as interference spiked across all sensors. Then the tactical display updated. And every coalition officer in the chamber went rigid. Because the UES Resolute had begun detaching its central spine. Not ejecting cargo. Not deploying fighters. Splitting. The ship was physically reconfiguring itself mid-battle, its armored segments unlocking and rotating into a new structural alignment. Massive magnetic clamps released with visible shockwaves as internal reactors surged beyond safe limits. Report. Threx snapped. The analyst's voice cracked. Sir, they're converting the ship into a kinetic impact structure. Threx froze. No, he said quietly. That's not possible. No vessel can survive that level of internal stress while maintaining navigation control. But even as he said it, the Resolute kept changing. Its nose hardened. Its core collapsed inward. Its engines, every last one of them, redirected into a single forward thrust channel. And its course adjusted. Directly toward the command nexus. Threx felt his stomach drop. "They're going to ram it," someone whispered. Not ram. Threx realized it at the exact same moment the words formed in his mind. Not a ram. A sacrifice. A controlled collapse of an entire warship's mass into a single point of impact strong enough to tear through anything, no matter the shielding. "Captain Varn," Threx said urgently, leaning toward the comms channel, "you will not survive that impact." Varn's eyes met his through the static. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Varn gave a small nod. "I know." And the channel went dark. The Resolute accelerated. Silence fell across the Coalition bridge so completely it felt unnatural. Outside, the battlefield continued its chaos, but inside that moment, everything seemed to pause as the impossible became undeniable. Admiral Threx stared at the display as the human ship tore forward, its hull glowing white-hot under structural stress that should have torn it apart already. "Divert all Coalition firepower to support that vector," he said suddenly. The officer blinked. "Sir?" "Now." And as Coalition fleets adjusted their trajectories, something shifted inside Threx's understanding of war again. Humans didn't just break formations. They rewrote the cost of victory itself. The void ahead of the Resolute was no longer empty. It had become a wall. A living, rotating construct of shields, weapon lattices, and overlapping dreadnought hulls, all converging into a single point of inevitability, the command nexus. Every instinct in the Coalition fleet screamed the same conclusion. Impenetrable. Unbreakable. Final. But the Resolute did not slow. Inside the collapsing human warship, alarms had stopped being meaningful. Every console glowed red. Entire sections of the ship had been sealed off, vented, or sacrificed to keep the forward mass stable. The crew moved like ghosts through smoke-filled corridors, each one already aware they were running out of ship faster than they were running out of time. Captain Elias Varn stood at the fractured bridge viewport, staring into the growing light of the enemy fortress. "Distance to impact vector?" he asked. No hesitation. No fear. Just calculation. 32 seconds, the navigation officer replied. Her voice was steady. Too steady. Because everyone aboard already understood what those seconds meant. Not survival time. Execution time. Varn nodded once. Begin final alignment. The ship shuddered violently as the Resolute's internal structure shifted again. Entire sections detached and were flung outward as counterweights, stabilizing the final trajectory. The hull groaned under forces that should have atomized it. Somewhere deep inside the vessel, metal failed. Then more metal. Then systems that had never been meant to experience this kind of stress simply ceased to exist. But the ship held. Barely. On the Coalition flagship, Admiral Threx was no longer speaking. He was watching. Because there was nothing left to order. The Resolute had become something beyond doctrine. Beyond classification. Every tactical model in the Coalition database was actively failing to describe what it was witnessing. "Sir," the analyst whispered, voice hollow, "the enemy command cluster is attempting emergency displacement." Threx's eyes narrowed. "They're trying to jump out." "Yes, sir, but the mass lock field is still active. If they engage a jump now, they'll tear themselves apart," Threx finished. A beat of silence. Then he said it. Humanity forced them into their own trap. The words tasted wrong. Because traps were supposed to be set by intelligence, patience, superiority. Not by a species screaming into the heart of an enemy formation at relativistic velocity. The display shifted again. The Resolute was now inside the outer shield ring. No longer approaching. In sight. A ripple of kinetic impacts erupted across its hull as automated defense systems finally recognized it as a threat within minimum engagement range. Turrets pivoted. Point defense grids opened fire at point-blank range. The ship flared under impact. Entire sections vaporized instantly. But the forward mass did not deviate. 20 seconds to impact, the navigation officer on the Resolute said. Her voice cracked slightly now. Not from fear. From strain. Because the ship was no longer responding as a vessel. It was responding as a weapon. Captain, she said quietly, we've lost dorsal stabilization. I know, Varn replied. Port guidance is offline. I know. Core temperature is. I know. Each interruption was softer than the last. Because there was nothing left to correct. Only one remaining function mattered now. Forward momentum. Inside the command nexus, alien officers scrambled around the central holotable. Emergency protocols were already engaged. Escape routes calculated. Shields reinforced to maximum. But none of it mattered. Because something impossible had already entered their defensive envelope. Impact in 15 seconds, the Resolute's officer said. Silence spread through the bridge. Varn looked around once. At his crew. At the flickering consoles. At the hull that was no longer a hull in any meaningful sense. And for the first time, something almost like sadness passed through his expression. Not regret. Not hesitation. Just acknowledgement. Transmit final message, he said. A communications officer hesitated. To who, sir? Varn's eyes stayed on the growing light ahead. All coalition forces. The pause. Then the message was sent. Every ship in the sector received it instantly. Captain Elias Varn's voice filled every channel. This is the UES Resolute. The beat. We are committed. Admiral Threx closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Because he understood what that meant. Not a battle order. Not a strategy update. A declaration. There would be no withdrawal. No surrender. No survival clause. Just completion. The Resolute entered the final shield layer. Space itself distorted under the intensity of overlapping energy fields as the ship tore through them, shedding entire structural layers as sacrificial mass. The forward hull was gone now. Only reinforced internal spine remained. Then even that began to fail. 5 seconds, the officer said. The command nexus fired everything it had. Every weapon. Every reserve grid. Every emergency system. The void lit up like a collapsing star. The Resolute did not stop. 4. Varn exhaled slowly. Not a sigh. A release. 3. The ship's remaining structure compressed into a single point of engineered inevitability. 2. Inside the coalition fleet, thousands of officers watched in absolute silence. 1. The Resolute struck. And reality bent. The impact did not look like an explosion at first. It looked like absence. For a fraction of a second, the entire command nexus simply vanished from every sensor feed. No debris, no radiation spike, no expanding fireball, just a perfect, impossible void where something massive had been. Then reality remembered it had been violated. The shockwave arrived late. It tore through space like a collapsing scream, ripping across shield lattices that had once been considered unbreakable. The layered defenses of the command nexus didn't fail in sequence, they failed all at once, as if every protective system had reached the same conclusion simultaneously. There was nothing left to protect against. On the coalition flagship, Admiral Threx staggered back a half-step as the tactical display overloaded in cascading error states. Report, he barked. No one answered immediately. Because there was nothing coherent to report. The analyst's voice finally came through, cracked and hollow. The command nexus, sir, it's gone. The pause. Gone how? Threx demanded. The analyst swallowed hard, staring at the data streams as they tried and failed to reconcile what had just happened. Structurally erased. No remaining mass signature consistent with original configuration. The entire formation center has been reduced to dispersed particulate expansion. Silence hit the bridge like a physical force. Even seasoned officers, veterans of 10,000 engagements, stood motionless. Because their doctrine had no term for what they were witnessing. Threx turned slowly back to the main display. Where the Nexus had been, there was now only drifting ruin. Enemy ships, moments ago perfectly coordinated, were now reacting in chaos. Entire fleets began to drift off alignment as command authority collapsed in real time. No orders. No structure. No cohesion. Just panic spreading through a superstructure too large to comprehend its own collapse. And then, a new signal. Sir, communications called out urgently, coalition-wide update from forward human units. Threx straightened. Put it through. Static cleared. And for a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then a voice. Not Captain Varn. Not even a soldier. A junior communications officer aboard a surviving human destroyer. Command Nexus confirmed neutralized. The voice said, breathless. The pause. Then almost disbelieving. Repeat, Command Nexus is down. I say again, it is down. On the bridge, someone let out a shaky breath they didn't realize they were holding. But Threx did not move. Because his eyes were still locked on the wreckage zone. Something was wrong. The Resolute was not there. Where is the impact vessel? He asked quietly. No one answered immediately. Then the sensor officer spoke, voice trembling. Searching, residual debris field, attempting to reconstruct final trajectory. A pause? Then, no confirmed survivable structure detected. The words landed differently this time. Not as tactical data. As consequence. Threx felt something cold settle in his chest. Not surprise. Not even grief yet. Something more primitive. Understanding. The Resolute had not survived. It had been designed not to. A controlled collapse weaponized into certainty. A single-use solution written in human doctrine with absolute disregard for cost. Sir, the analyst said quietly, if the Resolute was the only vessel that penetrated the inner ring at that velocity, then its crew. I know, Threx interrupted. His voice was low now. Stripped of command tone. Stripped of everything except weight. He looked again at the shattered battlefield. The enemy fleet was breaking apart without leadership. Entire wings were retreating, others firing blindly, some simply freezing in place as automated systems cycled through now useless protocols. The coalition had won the opening. But it did not feel like victory. Because the spear that made it possible was gone. A tactical officer spoke hesitantly. Coalition forward elements are requesting confirmation. They're asking if we should pursue retreating enemy formations. Threx hesitated. Just for a moment. Then he shook his head once. No. The officer blinked. Sir? No pursuit, Threx repeated. The pause. Then he added, quieter. Hold the line. The bridge went silent again. Because no one understood that order. But no one questioned it either. Not anymore. Threx stared at the broken center of the enemy fleet, at the space where impossible sacrifice had rewritten the outcome of the battle, and finally allowed himself to name what he was seeing. Humans did not treat victory as survival. They treated it as payment. Sometimes. They paid in full. Hours later, long after the battle had collapsed into scattered skirmishes and retreating signatures, the coalition fleet remained motionless across the broken sector. No celebration. No chance. No immediate strategic reassignment. Just silence. And in that silence, every coalition officer present understood something that would never be erased from military doctrine again. Some victories were too expensive to feel like winning. And somewhere in the drifting ruins of the battlefield, the legacy of the U.S. Resolute burned brighter than any surviving star in that sector. Not as a ship, but as proof of what humans were willing to become when the line was crossed. The battlefield did not end when the firing stopped. It only changed shape. What remained of the sector was no longer a structured engagement zone, but a graveyard of drifting hulls, fractured weapon arrays, and silent ships whose commanders no longer had anyone to command. The enemy fleet had scattered into broken remnants, retreating in blind, disorganized vectors that would take cycles to fully track and eliminate. Yet no one celebrated. Not the coalition fleets. Not the allied systems. Not Admiral Threx. Because every tactical display across the sector still carried the same unresolved absence. U.S. Resolute status, lost. The line stayed there, unmoving as if refusing to accept finality. On the coalition flagship, The bridge was quieter than any post-victory scenario should allow. Officers worked, yes. Damage reports, pursuit coordination, recovery operations, but it all felt distant. Mechanical. Like the body continuing to move after the mind had gone somewhere else entirely. Threx stood at the center of it all, staring at the frozen projection of the impact zone. No debris pattern matched standard destruction models. No survivable escape pods were detected. No last-minute jump signatures. Nothing. Just absence. Search teams have completed the inner ring sweep, the sensor officer reported carefully. No identifiable remnants of the Resolute crew have been recovered. The pause. Continue recovery sweep, Threx said. His voice was steady. Too steady. The officer hesitated. Sir, there is nothing left within safe retrieval size thresholds. Threx did not respond immediately. Then quietly, continue anyway. No one argued, because no one wanted to be the one to define the end. Hours later, deep within the fractured remains of the battlefield, a coalition recovery drone drifted through what had once been the command nexus perimeter. Its scanners flickered through residual radiation fields, mapping anomalies that made little sense. Then it stopped. Object detected, it transmitted. The signal reached the flagship instantly. Threx's eyes narrowed. Bring it up. The feed stabilized. At first, it looked like scrap. A twisted fragment of alloy, half melted, half reinforced, drifting in slow rotation through the void. It had once been part of a larger structure, possibly internal spinal reinforcement from a capital vessel. But something about it was wrong. It was too intact, too deliberate. Magnify, Threx ordered. The image zoomed in, and the bridge fell silent. Carved into the scorched surface of the metal was a marking. Not random, not damage. Intentional. A symbol. Human. The designation stamp of the UES Resolute. And beneath it, barely visible, etched into the heat-warped alloy as if forced into existence during the final moments of structural collapse, was a single line of engraved text. Threx leaned closer. The analyst read it aloud, voice uncertain. Hold the line. Silence. No one spoke. Because that phrase was not just instruction. It was memory. Threx straightened slowly, his gaze fixed on the fragment drifting in the projection. Recover it, he said at last. The pause. Then added, and classify it as sacred battlefield relic. No one questioned the wording. Not this time. Elsewhere in coalition space, the news spread faster than any formal report could contain it. The human ship that broke the nexus. The human captain who refused retreat. The human crew who turned themselves into the decisive strike. Stories formed instantly, half verified, half myth, all accepted. Not because they were fully understood, but because they felt true. And in the aftermath of war, truth often mattered less than meaning. On distant coalition worlds, young officers began repeating the phrase without knowing where it originated. Hold the line. It appeared in training simulations, in academy drills, in tactical briefings. Not as doctrine, as warning, because now everyone understood what it meant. It did not mean defend a position. It meant become the thing that makes retreat irrelevant. Back aboard the flagship, Admiral Threx finally turned away from the display. The battle was technically over, but something larger had begun. Admiral, a junior officer said hesitantly, High Command is requesting a full psychological assessment of the engagement, specifically human combat behavior. Threx gave a faint, humorless exhale. They will not understand it, he said. The officer frowned. Sir? Threx looked back once at the empty space where the Resolute had last existed. Then answered quietly, because they will try to measure it like strategy. The pause. But it was not strategy. He turned fully toward the command deck. It was commitment. And for the first time since the beginning of the engagement, Admiral Threx did something no one expected. He removed his formal command insignia from his uniform. Not in protest. Not in resignation. But in recognition. Because some battles did not end with victory reports. They ended with understanding so heavy it changed what you were allowed to call yourself afterward. and in the silent void where a human warship had turned itself into a final answer. The galaxy had learned a new definition of the word resolve. The days after the battle did not bring peace. They brought confirmation. Across coalition space, fragmented reports arrived in waves, each one describing the same impossible phenomenon from different angles. Enemy command collapse. Fleet-wide retreat. Structural breakdown of coordinated resistance. Entire war zones stabilizing without further engagement. Every report carried the same final variable at its center: human intervention. But none of them mentioned victory. Not in the traditional sense. Because what happened at the Nexus could not be neatly categorized as a win. It had rewritten the scale of cost entirely. On the Coalition flagship, Admiral Threx stood alone in the observation chamber, watching the sector map slowly resolve into post-conflict silence. Where the Resolute once existed in the database, there was now only an archived shadow file marked for permanent historical retention. No crew manifest updates. No survivor listings. No final transmission beyond the one phrase that had already spread beyond military channels into civilian systems. Hold the line. Threx repeated it quietly, almost to himself. The phrase no longer felt like an order. It felt like inheritance. Behind him, footsteps approached. "Admiral," a voice said carefully. He did not turn. "Report." A junior intelligence officer stepped into view, holding a data slate with visible hesitation. "We've completed reconstruction analysis of the Resolute's final maneuver sequence," she said. "We believe we can now fully model what happened structurally." Threx finally turned. "Explain." The officer swallowed once. It was not a simple kinetic impact. The ship didn't just accelerate into the target. It underwent staged internal collapse architecture, turning its entire mass into directional compression energy at the point of contact. The pause. In essence, the vessel ceased to function as a ship before impact. It became a singularity of force application. Threx listened without interruption, because part of him already understood that no conventional explanation would ever feel sufficient. "And the crew?" he asked quietly. The officer hesitated, then answered honestly. No survivability window existed after final alignment initiation. Silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just final. Threx nodded once. Then it was deliberate. "Yes, sir." Another pause. The officer looked down at her slate. "There's one additional finding." Threx raised his eyes slightly. "Speak." "We recovered encrypted internal logs from partial memory cores before system decay. Not tactical data, personal communications." The air in the chamber felt heavier. "Go on." The officer hesitated again, then continued. "The crew understood their probability of survival approaching final engagement at near zero. There are multiple recorded acknowledgments of that fact." The pause. "And still, they maintained course without deviation." Threx closed his eyes briefly. Not in exhaustion. In comprehension. "Show me," he said. The officer hesitated. "Sir, the content is..." "Show me." The slate activated. A fragmented audio reconstruction played through the chamber. Voices. Human. Some joking. Some quiet. Some simply breathing. Then Captain Varn's voice, distorted but clear enough to recognize. "No one is required to be here." The pause. "If you stay, you understand what this means." Silence in the recording. Then another voice, young, uncertain. "Sir, do we understand?" No speeches. No dramatic declarations. Just acceptance. Threx opened his eyes slowly as the recording ended. The officer looked down. That exchange repeats across multiple crew sections. Variations of the same confirmation. Voluntary continuation of mission parameters despite full awareness of outcome. Threx exhaled. "Remove the word voluntary," he said quietly. The officer blinked. "Sir?" He turned toward the viewport again. And for the first time, his voice carried something like weight that could not be lifted. "They did not volunteer," he said. "They decided." A long pause followed. Outside, distant fleets moved through recovery operations, But even those movements felt subdued, like the galaxy itself was still adjusting to a new rule it had not agreed to learn. Threx continued. There is a difference between choice and understanding, he said. Most species never meet that difference. Humans live inside it. The officer said nothing, because there was nothing to correct. After a moment, she spoke again. High Command is requesting doctrinal classification. They want to know how to categorize the resolute engagement for future threat modeling. Threx gave a faint, almost tired sound. A laugh without humor. Then he answered, "Tell them this cannot be modeled." The officer frowned slightly. "Sir?" He finally turned fully to face her. "Tell them it was not an operation," he said. "It was a threshold." A silence followed that even the ship's ambient systems seemed to respect. Then Threx added more quietly, "And we crossed it." The officer left without another word. Alone again, Threx remained in the observation chamber for a long time, watching nothing, thinking not of tactics, but of a ship that had turned itself into an irreversible point in history. Eventually, he reached into his pocket and placed a small insignia fragment on the ledge before him, salvaged from coalition debris recovery. It was the same phrase again. "Hold the line." Threx stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in his career, he spoke not as an admiral, but as someone who had finally understood what he had witnessed. "They don't hold the line," he whispered. "They become it." And far beyond that battlefield, across systems that would never fully comprehend what had been sacrificed to protect them, the story of the Resolute did not end. It spread. Not as military record, not as classified archive, but as something older, something closer to myth. And in every version of it, one truth remained unchanged. When the galaxy could not stand on its own, humanity did not negotiate. It stood in its place.